Yo, what is up, doggies? It's your boy Beanie Kowloon. In today's video, we're gonna be discussing a bit of MK Ultra. MK Ultra tells the story of America's attempt at brain control, and through the CIA's research on this mind control, they also abused hundreds of Americans both physically and psychologically. The more you look into MK Ultra, the more wild it gets. Like, the things they would do to try to brainwash these people is just absolutely psychotic. And the people who've suffered abuse from the CIA's mind control experiments vary all the way from the creator of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest to the fucking Unabomber. And if that's not wild and wacky enough, did I mention it's because of the CIA's experiments on LSD that LSD was introduced to America. Now, there's a lot of wild and wacky stuff to cover about MK Ultra, so I say we just start from the beginning. The year is 1947, and a lot of Americans are afraid of a certain ideology that goes by the name communism. While the theme song to communism does bang, it wasn't really a political ideology that most Americans wanted to get behind. And well, because of this, and also because of the attacks on Pearl Harbor, America created the CIA to fight off the Soviet threat and also do other shady things that we just don't even know about. But the biggest issue on everyone's mind at this time in America was the communist threat. And through the CIA's research on the Soviet Union, they were quite convinced that the Soviets had created some kind of mind control that they were using on their people and could possibly use on our people. And it's the same situation where we thought the Soviets were going to the moon. We were like, well, if they're going to the moon, fuck it, we're gonna do it too. So the CIA decided that they were also going to figure out mind control. The year was 1953 when the CIA first formed MK Ultra, and they appointed a head chemist who was known as Sidney Gottlieb. And Sidney is, well, what most people would like to call a mad scientist, and also just completely deranged. Stephen Kisner was a journalist at this time, and he would write about the stuff that Sidney was doing with MK Ultra. Some quotes he said was, Gottlieb wanted to create a way to seize control of people's minds, and he realized there was a two-part process. First, you had to blast away the existing mind. Second, you had to find a way to insert new mind into the resulting void. We didn't get too far onto number 2, but we did a lot of work on number 1. Kisner would also later go on to say, we don't know how many people died, but a number did, and many lives were permanently destroyed. So yeah, this Gottlieb guy was not messing around. He had no care for human life, and he just wanted to figure out mind control.
As this 1952 CIA memo says, the aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation.
Now, the two biggest ways he would do this were electroshock therapy and LSD. At the time, none of the common people knew what LSD was, as it was just created in Switzerland by Albert Hofmann. Albert Hofmann was researching new medicines and was actually trying to cure a headache when he accidentally synthesized LSD. As soon as LSD was created, there was tons of interest in the scientific community and those who knew about it, as this was some new chemical that was just completely wild and wacky. So at the time, really only top chemists knew about this, but the chemists knew that this was a very powerful drug that could have many uses for the human mind. And while one of these chemists really interested in LSD was the head of MK Ultra, Sidney Gottlieb. In the early 1950s, Sidney Gottlieb would arrange for the CIA to pay $240,000 to buy up nearly the whole world's supply of LSD. Sidney Gottlieb truly believed that LSD would be the key to mind control, and he got to experiments right away. There were many other drugs used in MK Ultra, such as MDMA, mescaline, heroin, barbiturates, methamphetamine, and magic mushrooms, but LSD is just really the most notable because if it wasn't for MK Ultra, we wouldn't have LSD. Now, there were many experiments the CIA performed for MK Ultra, and they were also all over the world testing with all different kinds of people. Some of the first experiments the CIA did with LSD was Operation Midnight Climax. In this experiment, the CIA would lure unsuspecting US citizens to a CIA safe house where they would force these unwilling participants to take acid. And how the CIA would accomplish this is they would set up fake prostitutes that would lead them to these houses, give them a drink that was dosed with acid, so none of these people had any idea what was going on. And while CIA agents would be sitting on the other side of this room looking through a two-way mirror, just chilling out, drinking cocktails, and just watching these people absolutely lose their minds. Here are some testimonies of former CIA agents that worked in these safe houses for Operation Midnight Climax.
A former CIA official who worked in the safe houses reveals that they were used not only for drug testing, but to study sexual behavior and how it could be used to manipulate people.
We did quite a study of prostitutes and their behavior. How do you take a woman who is willing to use her body to get money out of a guy to get him to talk about things which are much more important, like state secrets?
Some entries from George White's diaries. Clarice gets horrors. Janet, sky high. As one agency memo says, we have no answer to the moral question.
Agent George White, who worked with Sidney Gottlieb on Operation Midnight Climax, wrote about the experience saying, I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, and cheat, steal, deceive, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? Like, goddamn, the people running these operations were like honestly pure evil, and this is just the beginning. Like, it gets much, much worse. Sidney Gobbert would end up working with chemists and scientists from Nazi concentration camps and Japanese concentration camps. As well, in both these concentration camps, both the Japanese and the Nazis also tried their own hand at mind control, and Sidney was taking notes and learning from them. So not only were the people running MKUltra straight demons, they were also fucking Nazis. MKUltra's experimentations with LSD would expand greatly once they decided to send LSD out to many colleges of America.
Millions of dollars would be spent on LSD research at universities throughout the country, and word would begin to spread on campus about this so-called mind-blowing drug. And suddenly, there was the counterculture of the 60s.
And more specifically, the acid was given to the scientists of these colleges who were asked to perform experiments on people trying to figure out if this could be used as mind control. And while this idea would kind of backfire greatly, as many scientists who got a hold of this acid would end up taking it and realizing this is not a mind control drug, this is a drug that frees your mind. And while many people who were experimented on with LSD in college would end up actually enjoying the experience and seeing a ton of recreational and medicinal value in this. Most notably of these people was Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who would go through one of these LSD experiments in the University of Stanford. Kesey would end up actually really enjoying the experience of LSD and would try promoting it to just about anyone around. Ken Kesey was actually so into promoting LSD, he would end up buying a bus with all his hippie friends, which they would decorate into basically just the hippie mobile. And on this bus, Ken Kesey and all his friends would just trip mad acid and give away free acid to anyone who wanted it. This was a really big push to the hippie revolution that grew to be massive in the 1960s. Another notable person who participated in these LSD experiments was Robert Hunter, who was a member of the band The Grateful Dead. And while the Grateful Dead and Ken Kesey's LSD parties were a great contributor to the hippie movement in the 1960s, and while this whole movement and the LSD that fueled it just wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the CIA literally sending it out to all these colleges, so we gotta thank the CIA for acid. But not all these college experiments on acid would work out well for the participants. Perhaps the most infamous MKUltra participant is someone known as Ted Kaczynski, or otherwise known as the Unabomber. Ted was a student at Harvard University where these experiments took place. And while many believe that these experiments were partially the cause of why Ted went nutty insane and decided to live in the woods and start sending out bombs to public figures. And while those are just the notable people that were experimented on in college with acid, this was widespread all across America. But sending LSD to colleges really did little to further the research between LSD and mind control, but it did a lot to help raise the commercial use of LSD. But these still weren't the only experiments that they were doing for MKUltra. The real fucked up experience would take place on prisoners and people outside of America. Sidney Gobbert truly had the power to do whatever he wanted, and he did. Richard Helm, someone who worked with him in the CIA, said this on the matter. This guy had a license to kill. He was allowed to requisition human subjects across the United States and around the world and subject them to any kind of abuse that he wanted, even up to the level of being fatal. Yet nobody looked over his shoulder. He never had to file serious reports to anybody. I think the mentality must have been that this project is so important, mind control, if it can be mastered, it's the key to the global world power. So yeah, the CIA and Sidney Gobbert did not care how many people they completely fucked up or even killed, because they were just trying to figure out mind control. So let's look into some of these more fucked up experiments. One of the first known deaths of these LSD experiments was actually an experiment done on a fellow CIA worker, Frank Olson.
The best known case is that of this man, Frank Olson, a chemist employed by the Army Chemical Corps, who in 1953 was slipped LSD unknowingly at a meeting with CIA officials. Shortly after that, Olson went into severe depression. He ended his life at this New York hotel by diving through a shaded closed window in his 10th floor room.
And while perhaps the most fucked up part about this death is that the CIA completely lied to his entire family, his wife and his kids, about how he died, as they told the family that he had just committed suicide and completely left out the fact that they dosed him with acid. And here's his wife discussing the situation.
And I'm sure they left the house feeling ever so much better because I had been gracious and hospitable to them, so that I must have played right into their hand and made them feel fine.
23 years later, how did you feel about that meeting?
My anger was unbelievable at how I had been duped for this length of time, and the anguish which was unnecessary.
But perhaps an even more fucked up story is the story of what MKUltra did to crime boss Whitney Bulger. Whitney Bulger was a high-ranking member of the Mafia in the early 1950s, but he would later get arrested for armed robbery and truck hijacking. And whilst in prison, the CIA told him that they wanted to use him for experiments on schizophrenia, and they told him if he would do it, they would reduce his prison sentence. And while Whitney Bulger gladly agreed to this, but he had no idea what he was signing up for. The experiments that they would end up committing on this dude are truly just some of the most fucked up forms of torture I've ever seen. The CIA would end up giving Whitney Bulger LSD for every day for over a year. And while I could just only imagine how fucked up this would really be, like, imagine stripping for over a year straight, being locked in a room, getting experiments performed on you. Like, Jesus Christ. Bulger would later write on his experiences, describing them quite horrific as he thought he was going insane. He wrote, "I was in prison for committing a crime, but they committed a greater crime on me." Bulger would also talk about what these experiments were like, and he would describe them as, in minutes the drug would take over, and about 8 or 9 men, Dr. Piffler and several men in suits who were not doctors, would give us tests to see how we reacted. 8 convicts in panic and paranoid states, total loss of appetite, hallucination, the room would change shape, hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning into skeletons right in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane. So yeah, not the optimal set and setting for a trip. Once they finally finished with the experiments on Bulger and Bulger actually realized what they were doing to him, Bulger had told his friends that he had found the doctor in Atlanta who was the head of the experiment program, and while Bulger's plan was to go over there and kill him. Sadly though, Bulger would never actually kill this guy, and I say sad because, you know, it'd be pretty badass to go back and kill the dude who did all these fucked up experiments to you. Like, that shit could be a movie right there. But sadly, Bulger would just continue doing his mobster shit, and he would end up getting arrested again in like 2011. And in 2018, he was found beaten to death by many inmates while he was still in a wheelchair as he was 89 years old. And while the final MKUltra testing I'd like to take a look at doesn't really have too much documented research as it was overseas, and also all this was basically kept 100% secret, and none of the public knew about it. But overseas in Europe and Asia, the CIA would capture enemy agents and other people they felt could be expendable. And these people were thrown into cells and subjected to all kinds of fucked up testing. Not only would they give these patients huge concoctions of psychedelic drugs, but they would also experiment with electroshock therapy, extreme temperatures, and sensory isolation. And whilst the CIA agents were torturing them, they would bombard them with questions trying to see if they could break down the resistance and find a way to destroy the human ego. These experiments weren't about learning how the human mind works, but it was about learning how to destroy the human mind. There are countless victims to MKUltra and countless more that we'll just never know about. All these experiments that I discussed ran all the way from 1953 to 1973. And while Gottlieb's conclusion on these experiments is that mind control is just simply impossible. So after ruining hundreds of people's lives and even killing some of them, the research did little to nothing to help us figure out mind control, and all it really did was introduce acid to America. And even after these failed fucked up experiments, the CIA would keep Gottlieb on their side. He would end up developing many poisons and high-tech gadgets that the CIA still uses. So yeah, a lot went down with MKUltra, and a lot more happened that I just don't even have time to discuss. But yeah, basically the gist of it is, in the CIA's attempt for mind control, they ended up just giving us one of the greatest drugs known to man, LSD. I mean shit, dogs, in the famous words of John Lennon, they invented LSD to control people, and what they did was give us freedom. Some powerful stuff, doggy, so powerful. Honestly, that quote is the whole reason I made this video. But either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, drop a like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and as always, peace out, doggies.